All right, Troy, what do you say we get this show on the road? I've just started the recording here, so we can officially kick things off now. We've let everybody into the room. Thank you for joining me. Quick introduction. I'm Scott. For those of you that have not seen me before, I'm the founder here at Report URI, and I have a good friend with me, cybersecurity extraordinaire, founder of Have I Been Pwned. I'll let you do the rest of your intro, Troy.
That's nice. We should do this more often. Thank you. Have I been? It feels like it's all have I been pwned guy these days. But I have a deep interest in the things that you're talking about. But I also feel like it's been a couple of years since I have been as deep as what you are. So I'm kind of curious to see where the gaps are now.
Nice, yeah. For a bit of background for everybody here, of course, we're focusing on the new PCI DSS requirements. So, the version 4.0.1 here, as much as that is a minor version bump, it was actually quite a big change for the parts that we're going to talk about. So, I do have a full webinar available online if you go to the Report Your Eye site into resources and webinars with a full breakdown of what PCI DSS is and like a major review of the 4.0 requirements. And what we're going to focus on in this webinar now is just the minor, and I'm air quoting minor, the minor changes that were introduced in 4.0.1. And I thought that I'd bring Troy along so that we can kind of go through these from obviously the compliance perspective from somebody, as Troy just said, like myself, who's very deep into all of this. But I really kind of want to pitch these requirements at Troy and get a very kind of simple approach from a technology security person on what would you do to meet these requirements without the bias of being deeply involved in this industry. So I really want just kind of like an open and frank discussion on exactly what the purpose of these requirements are. So the whole kind of background on the 4.0 requirements, PCI DSS 4.0 was an enormous change and it introduced heaps of new stuff. And we're focusing on just the subset that's kind of relevant to mine and Troy's area of speciality, which is web security. And for many, many years, we've, as Troy will tell you with Have I Been Pwned, suffered many, many breaches across industry. And we're looking at a very specific category here, which is around an organization, a group, a collective, if we can call them that, referred to as Magecart. And their speciality is finding ways to compromise web applications that have some kind of e-commerce component. So they take credit card payments on their website, and their speciality is finding a way to skim that credit card data off the page. So they will find a way to get their malicious JavaScript, their malicious code into your web page. And then as your customers and your visitors are going through that checkout process, typing in their full card number, their security code, their name, their address, this code in the background will be skimming a copy of that data and depositing it with the attackers. They'll collect that for however long they can go unnoticed for, and we'll look at some of the attacks in just a moment. In some cases, it can be many, many, many months that they're scooping up this data. And then, of course, at the end of that process, they need to hit the cards with fraudulent transactions and cash out. So this is known as web skimming or e-skimming. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to. And the particular requirements in the new standard that we're looking at are designed to address this specific issue. Now, if I just kind of grab, and Troy, you might remember some of these, the
Mhm.
real headline events of Magecart here. So just kind of skimming back through my mind. And many of these breaches not only obviously made the news, but they made mainstream news. They made like BBC News headlines for us here in the UK, especially with British Airways and Ticketmaster. So not only did these companies end up with this malicious JavaScript on their website, they of course lost, whole troves of customer data as well. So it's not just the payment card data, which is of course the target. That's what the attackers want. That's where they can make their money. But they're also taking things like names and addresses and usernames and passwords and any other potentially sensitive information that users are providing on the website. And Troy, I think you even gave some commentary across some of these incidents at the time, right? Especially when British Airways, I think, was probably the most notable here.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, Ticketmaster and British Airways are the ones that popped out to me because they're the most, probably the most well-known brands that people have the greatest amount of affinity to. And I guess your point there is kind of interesting. I hadn't sort of thought about it in the skimming context before. As soon as you say skimming, I think of like a machine and you put the
Yeah.
card in, but there's another thing in there and it catches the card as you go in. But it really is the digital equivalent of that, isn't it?
Yeah, you go to the checkout in the store and you see people now. I've come across a few videos where they tug on the fascia of the machine and it pops off. And like you say,
Yeah.
there's this physical device attached to the front that's reading the card data as the card goes through. And it's really no different here. And I've dissected some of these attacks. Again, I have a full dissection of the British Airways hack on a freely available webinar. And we're quite literally talking about some single digit number of lines of JavaScript. How many lines of JavaScript do you think it would take you to log a key and then Ajax the keystroke out of the back to log it in some location that you can access it later? So as you can see here, Magecart really started picking up their pace probably around about 2014, I would say, is when they began to find their stride. They peaked through 2018 to 2020. And it's not just losing the card data. Some of these organizations, especially British Airways and Ticketmaster, again, they got fined tens of millions from data regulators just for losing names and addresses and things. Then they get fined by the card companies for losing the card data. And then there's the reputational damage as well. So nowadays, it kind of terrifies, especially under GDPR. If Ticketmaster and British Airways had happened under the fine structure for GDPR, I dread to think what the fines would have been. So given that they, Magecart ran riot, built themselves up to, fame, if we can call it that, the payment card industry finally sat together and said, we need some requirements to stop this from happening because this is costing heaps of money. It's causing untold inconvenience and problems for customers who have their data stolen. We need to put something in place to stop this. And if we look at the kind of taxonomy of an attack, it's a very simple process, and that gives us some clear-cut opportunities on where we can address this. Of course, there has to be some breach in the first instance. Now, historically, you might think of this and think it's, the vendor's website that got breached. So, it was the Ticketmaster website that got breached or the British Airways site that got breached. And they're actually not. In the vast majority of these cases, if we look at all of the major Magecart attacks, they're actually a breach in a dependency. But either way, somebody somewhere, of course, has to be breached to introduce this new foreign malicious code. So that is the point at which we allow the injection of malicious JavaScript. So this is effectively step one of the attack. We have to get our malicious JavaScript into the page. And then, of course, we think, this is the terrible point. This is when the bad thing has happened. But actually getting JavaScript into the page isn't immediately useful. What you then need to do is exfiltrate the data because the attackers need to take the card data away. So there's two clear-cut points here. Number one, the injection of the script. But number two, it's the exfiltration of the data is arguably the point at which the breach happens. So these are the two major things that the council have tried to address with these requirements is prevent the injection of the malicious code, and if not, stop the exfiltration of the sensitive data. So if you go kind of looking through the version 4.0.1 document, it's a massive, enormous document, and we're going to drill down into just the two requirements that are very kind of specific to addressing this particular issue. So I've got a screenshot from the standard, hopefully like not too much, not too much looking at standards documents in this webinar, but this is version 4.0.1. So if you're looking at the major release of 4.0, we're also going to discuss the fact that the text has changed here. So make sure you're looking at the latest version. And we're going to go through these three main bullet points here with Troy and see what would from a technology person's perspective, like what would you actually do to address them without all of the kind of fanfare and the bias of compliance backgrounds like some of us may have. So in order to start addressing this problem, requirement 6.4.3 says all payment page scripts. So of course, the payment card industry are only concerned with pages that touch payment card data. So this is only required on payment pages. But all payment page scripts that are loaded and executed in the consumer's browser are managed as follows. So the first bullet point here says that we must have a method is implemented to confirm that each script is authorized. So from just a plain English reading of that requirement, and they haven't specified the technical approach. Of course, the council are only specifying their desired outcome, which is a method is implemented to confirm that each script is authorized. What approach is off the top of your head, and I've not prepped Troy for this at all, but what approach is off the top of your head could you come up with to try and satisfy this requirement?
Well, when I read that, and first of all, I'm just glad I don't do compliance stuff anymore. But when I read that, it feels very much like we need to make sure that the requested script is something that is meant to be requested. So I would argue that you could possibly use content security policy and say there's an allowable set of script sources. So that might be from yourself, from the own host, or from an external dependency, which that point alone doesn't solve the problem that you raised before in terms of what happens when external dependencies are compromised. But I think we're getting to that as we go down the bullet points.
Yep.
So I think, yeah, I mean, really the only thing you've got there, assuming that this needs to work when there is compromise, is some sort of content security policy on allowed sources.
Yeah, and this is definitely kind of like one of the suggested technical approaches from the council. So, as I said, the council will never mandate a particular technological approach or a particular solution or vendor. They specify the desired outcome. And if we actually just briefly skip to the next page, because you can see the guidance column here, the council give you some pretty clear guidance on how to do this. The guidance column rolls to the next page, and we'll just kind of briefly skip to that because you can see here content security policy is mentioned as one of the suggested ways in which this can be done. But of course, wanting to leave this open to other implementations and solutions as well, kind of reading between the lines, they're really summarizing on, and I would probably say like three or four different technology approaches. So number one is content security policy, native browser security control. Don't need any tools or licensing. It's built into every modern browser. We then also have some kind of script or tag management system. So, some vendor could load their JavaScript product that then takes control of all of the content on the page, and they can use that to control what script is present. Or there's like a synthetic browser slash external scanner approach, where if you have some external scanner scanning your page on, let's say once per day, that external scanner can observe what is on the page, and then between today and tomorrow and whenever we can detect change. So they have left it quite free and open in terms of how we are going to achieve the fact that all scripts on the page are authorized. But definitely, obviously with my complete bias on show, but content security policy would also be the first thing that popped to my mind as well. But there are different ways that you can approach this requirement and attempt to meet that. Now, it's interesting you say that because, as you kind of very correctly pointed out, a method is implemented to confirm that each script is authorized, and that's merely just the presence, I guess you could say, of the script itself. So, rolling very neatly into the second bullet point, then, this requires here that a method is implemented to assure the integrity of each script. Now, as read, I'm interested in your take on this because there'll be some things that I might need to add afterwards.
What the first thing that you think about when you look at that first bullet point, content security policy is fantastic. On the previous slide, when you're talking about compromise of external dependencies, remember the browse allowed situation where there was a
Yeah.
browse allowed usability component which was loaded into all of these websites, including a bunch of government ones. And if you had have allowed, let's say for argument's sake, browseallowed.com, scripts may be loaded from browseallowed.com. You're like, okay, sweet, done. What happens when that script is maliciously changed? So you satisfy point one. But that brings us to point two, which is the integrity side of things. So how do we make sure that the script is actually doing what we expect it to do, and it's not just coming from the right place, i.e. is authorized? And obviously the technical solution we have there is sub-resource integrity.
It is. Now, this is one of the interesting things that, especially at Report Your Eye, I do, the majority of our enterprise customer onboarding, and SRI is like the first thing that I think of when I speak to them. It's like, hey, we need to assure the integrity of scripts, and we have this thing that assures the integrity of scripts, and it's built into the browser and it's free, so we should all use this. Now, this is when we hit all of the bumps in the road with SRI because and it's kind of interesting that you use the browse allowed example because one of the issues that we had with browse allowed was the JavaScript is dynamic. So the library that you load from the vendor is not a statically versioned file, like, version 3.1.2.min.js. It is effectively, it was / latest.js. So if you were to then deploy SRI, and many vendors do this, and if you load the Stripe.js and anybody else that has a payment provider, you'll know that their JavaScript is typically dynamic as they respond and implement new technologies and fraud prevention measures and things like that. So in that scenario, can we safely say that we've excluded SRI as a candidate?
Well, this is, I think, the uncomfortable truth with this. And I know that we've both put this to people in workshops before when they go, look, we can't use SRI because the script changes and it's managed by an external party. And then you say, okay, so what you're saying is that that external party can do whatever they want to that script and you will run it in your client's browsers, and that's a feature. And then they're like, oh, that sounds kind of bad the way you put it like that. So, yeah,
Yeah. When you
it
say it
is,
how
it
it
sounds kind
is,
of bad.
it doesn't sound
Yeah.
good. So yeah, it gets tricky because, purely on a this is a terrible idea approach, completely agree with you, but on a purely, technological standpoint, if that's the position you find yourself in, then you can't use SRI. And it's like, well, we're going to deploy the SRI now, but then when our vendor patches the JavaScript or launches a new feature, everything will break until we figure it out and then we fix it. And especially on a payment page where, they're usually quite important to most organizations, the level of risk people are willing to tolerate is quite low. So ruling SRI out, this is where things kind of get interesting because in the traditional interpretation of the word integrity, and I kind of do what you did in the beginning, which was you're thinking of like the hashing the letters of the code kind of file integrity with hashes and things like that.
Hmm.
But if we look again, if we switch over to the guidance column, they gave us some examples on how the integrity of scripts can be enforced. And of course, SRI, as it rightly should be, is the number one thing. If SRI is the suitable solution for you, then that's what you should use. But if you have any kind of, dynamic dependency, you're immediately kind of stuck. So the second requirement here is then a content security policy, which limits the locations the consumer browser can load a script from and transmit account data to. And of course, being a CSP focused product, this is the approach that we took. And the reasoning, because we've been very heavily involved with the council speaking on this, is content security policies monitoring the behavior of the page. And you're correct that if you're loading, let's maintain the example, the browser allowed JavaScript, if that JavaScript changes, then it's going to, if it's trying to, exhibit some other behavior, the behavior of the page will change. So it may try to pull other JavaScript dependencies, which would then be held against the script source. They may just embed directly their malicious code into the browser allowed JavaScript, which is what happened to, was it Ticketmaster? Was that the browser? No, that was the government one, sorry, wasn't it?
The
Browser allowed.
government ones, US courts and things like that, and
So
the
they
ICO.
put, yes, yeah, the data watchdog. So they put the malicious JavaScript into their actual file. So up until this point, your exact kind of problem would still be correct. But then they have to still exfiltrate the data from the page. They have to send it somewhere useful to the attackers because having JavaScript in the page is not actually helpful. Getting the data out and into the attacker's hands. And this is why we have this kind of two-pronged approach just a minute ago. Number one, try and detect the injection of the code. But then, if one of your trusted dependencies is compromised, it's not new code coming in, it's existing code being changed. We can then catch the exfiltration. So if they try and create a form and submit it and post the data out, if they try and do an XHR in JavaScript and send the data, we're then observing, the integrity of the script in a more behavior-based way on the page by observing what is the page doing. And when the page starts to do things it didn't do before, that's when we start to detect. So, given that SRI is a little too fragile, there had to be other allowable approaches. And as we can see, CSP is one of those. Now, what is your immediate kind of take on that as explained so far?
Well, we still have blind spots because if SRI is not going to work in every case because you're dependent on dynamic content of external scripts, and CSP authorizes the location that data may be served from, but not necessarily the data or rather the integrity itself. But then again, to your point, if that can control things like XHR requests, well, that still gets us some way. But from recollection, I don't think CSP is meant to actually control data exfiltration directly, is it?
No, it's not a stated objective, but the kind of the corner, once we looked at the fragility, if we can call it that, of SRI, like SRI is the number one thing that people gravitate to, but we have to find something that can get us close enough to give us the level of protection that we need, which is we don't want a JavaScript keylogger on our site for 7 months that goes undetected. So with a robust CSP, whilst there are still these minuscule edge cases where things may be able to happen, in all of the examples of the Magecart attacks that we looked at just a moment ago, we have done a good dissection on a few of them and have webinars. We could have, number one, detected and number two, prevented all of them with a content security policy. And if you look on the Report Your Eye demo site, we actually have the Ticketmaster keylogger JavaScript running and showing how it's blocked with a content security policy. So whilst it's not a stated objective, it is a capability that we have. Now,
It works.
oh, sorry.
It works anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we have the ability to control things coming into the page and things coming out of the page. And, that very nicely aligns with the two-pronged approach that we're trying to stop here. Because the final solution, the third example, just to finish off the integrity point here, is a proprietary script or tag management system which can prevent malicious script execution. So this is the idea where you load the vendor's product into the page and it's some kind of JavaScript library. And then, of course, it can protect against everything that falls below it on the page. And one of the big drawbacks that I saw with this one is because content security policy is in the headers, there is no content that can possibly be above us because we're quite literally in the
Mm.
response headers. Whereas if you're a script-based solution, number one now, it's kind of like a race to the top of the DOM to see who can get their script tag the highest, because the highest script tag wins. And normally, where do you want to put script tags on your page if you're
Yeah,
loading big?
down the end, after all the other important stuff loads.
So again, the method had to be open and free. None of these methods are going to be perfect solutions because even with SRI, you if we were to deploy SRI at any point in time, you're effectively locking to the integrity of the file now. Does that imply that you've code reviewed it and there's no functionality in there that might be exercised
Yeah.
later but doesn't show now? So none of these approaches are perfect. And I think we should probably not be trying to achieve perfect either. I don't think that you can achieve perfect. The
Because
goal,
that's sort of the argument of what's the known good copy, right? Like if you're going to
yes.
trust and run one copy, which is the good one? And I think the closest people sort of get to that is, yeah, when we're using SRI to load external dependencies from a CDN or something, and you go, well, they say, well, how do you trust that one? You go, well, how do you trust the one on your own website? Oh, well, we always have. So,
Has
there's
anybody
that
ever
default
code
position.
reviewed jQuery? Like,
Yeah.
there's only 30 megabytes of JavaScript there, Troy. Have you not gone through
I,
and
I
coded
figure
through that?
someone else will find it before me if there's a problem, and they'll let us know or something.
So yeah, we have to acknowledge this, and we have to be realistic that nobody's saying that there is a solution here that is perfect, right? Like all of these options are something that can give us a very, very good solution, and I'm very clear and transparent with this with customers that we onboard. There is no such thing as perfect. We're never going to get there. However, what we can do is stand back and say, do you know what? We took all reasonable measures and we really put a solid effort into this. And I think that everybody should be happy if whichever technical approach that you use, everyone should be really happy that that's the target. So there's a really good comment in the chat here actually, and I did say earlier if the comments were topical, we would address them as we go rather than at the end. So there was a question here from a member of the audience that said, "What about using a WAF where you can control the traffic in some ways?" And this is another one of the kind of approaches that I'm starting to see be a little bit more kind of popular. So if you imagine if your website is going through a CDN provider, then that CDN provider can inspect your page and obviously the content of the page as it transits the CDN. Now, the problem is with some of the wording in 643 is not so bad. When we get to the next requirement in a minute, there's a very kind of sharp focus. If we read 6.4.3 again, all payment page scripts that are loaded and executed in the consumer's browser. Now, not necessarily all JavaScript is going to be in the page at the point you transit through the CDN. So unless a CDN provider is going to pick up JavaScript in the page and then execute that JavaScript to see if that introduces additional dependencies, then observing it at a midpoint is not necessarily observing all of the JavaScript. And that's why they're very clear in the wording here to say in the consumer's browser. Because the flip side to this comment is you could just do that analysis on the origin server and say, oh, well, I've only put these three script tags in the page, so I know everything that's there. But if you push that page to the client and the client executes the JavaScript, it may introduce additional dependencies.
So,
So
so
what,
like to paraphrase, if you wrap Cloudflare around your website and it inspects everything as the requests come through, but then on the client side, you're pulling scripts from some other place and that's not going through the same pipeline.
then it's skirting around because it's not your content that's being delivered. So, not to say that it obviously can't be done. It can be done, and there are products and solutions that do this, where they pull the page in and effectively, virtualize the page and then allow the dependencies to trigger and fire, and then look what they pull in. But we're back to, the great thing with the tag management solution or the CSP solution is that you are quite literally in the client alongside the visitor at the point that they're browsing. And with, either the external scanners, I have other similar concerns where you can serve different content to a scanner when they scan your site than the user sees, and maybe not necessarily all of the JavaScript is firing in the same way. There's just something I like about the idea of being sat right alongside the user at the keyboard rather than doing some synthetic or virtual browsing to see if we can get things to fire in a non-standard way.
Yeah, because you are actually looking at what is really running on that client's machine as opposed to what is emulated by some third-party product somewhere in the pipeline.
Exactly. And again, my to be fully transparent, my bias is maybe showing through here, but that's what drew me to the technical approach of like content security policy is you are quite literally effectively sat beside the user, guarding them as they're doing it. And like you say, it's not emulated, it's not virtualized. So we've covered off the first two kind of points there pretty good in 6.4.3. And the final one here, and this is where if you're looking at the old version 4.0 standard, you'll notice there's a very subtle but actually massive change. So it says that an inventory of all scripts is maintained with written business or technical justification as to why each is necessary. Now, to show you what the change was, the previous wording was that an inventory of all scripts is maintained with a written justification as to why each is necessary. So and in the old one here, they had a definition of what the word necessary was, and it was necessary for the purposes of processing the payment.
Mm.
So they stripped out the word necessary, the definition of the word necessary, and they added a written business or technical justification. Now, I'm pretty sure you could come up with some creative business justifications on why you need JavaScript, Troy.
But you can have unnecessary ones now.
Well, they all have to be
If there's a business
necessary.
reason.
You just have to come up with a business reason why it's necessary. Could you come up with a business reason to make any JavaScript that you want necessary?
Well, inevitably, there's going to be a reason to put it on there. So if it's like tracking tags or something, it's like, well, there's a business
Yep.
justification. We need to upsell our customers.
Yep. AI chatbots on the payment pages, like support ticketing systems, tracking pixels, marketing integrate. So this was a real kind of, I feel like, weakening of the strength of this control to go from strictly necessary. Like the original view under 4.0 was you will have your payment page and you will have the JavaScript to process the card payment, and no other JavaScript will touch that page. And the kind of explosion of feedback from industry was very, very strong. And people are like, whoa, hang on, we can't do tracking and marketing on the payment page. And, part of me was thinking, they're on the payment page. You already have them.
They're giving you
Like,
the money already.
like let them pay in peace and safety.
Yeah.
And you can track them all the way through the checkout flow up to the payment page, and then you can track them from the success page. But just on this one page in the middle where we're handling this ultra sensitive data, the original view of the council was if we just chop down the whole amount of JavaScript, then the attack surface goes from enormous to basically nothing. But unfortunately, and I can kind of see the tricky position the council was in. The vast majority of websites just have one standard set of script tags that they inject globally with things like GTM, Google Tag Manager. So I can kind of see there was a bit of an effort there to trim those down. But, ultimately, I don't know what their final, kind of deciding factor to cave on this requirement was, but they did. And they've now said you can have any JavaScript there as long as there is a technical or business justification. And what we've now seen is that everybody's keeping the exact same set of JavaScript dependencies across their whole site, including the payment page.
And hey, Scott, when it says an inventory of all scripts, is that just like the first party script, or if they have downstream dependencies that load other scripts, does that have to be in the inventory?
So it's an inventory of all scripts. So if there is a script present on the page, it must be inventoried.
Right, but if you have a script and then it calls something else and it calls something else, do those other two things have to be
So
inventoried?
first, third, and fourth party scripts are included. Yes, that is
And
clarified.
we've just had the discussion about how they can be dynamic.
Yep,
So your inventory today could be different to tomorrow without touching the code.
correct.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds like
So
fun.
this is part of the reason why I think softening this has kind of introduced a little bit more overhead than perhaps people realized. Now, the really good thing is, with a content security policy based approach, then you're fine, because if a new third or fourth party dependency is introduced, then the content security policy will detect it and it will be reported back to you. So even if you haven't deployed a change, and we see this
Mm.
all the time, you haven't deployed a change to your site, and then you get an alert from us that says like, hey, you have a new JavaScript dependency. And people are like, well, hang on a minute, we've not deployed a change. And we dig into it and it's like, but one of your dependencies has introduced a new dependency. And it's similar with the script tag management approach. Those vendors' products in the page will be able to detect those additional dependencies loaded downstream. And likewise, if we're doing it in the CDN in the middle approach, as long as they're fully running, proper virtualization of the page, they'll be able to see those dependencies added later. But it is good in that it's now forcing you as the operator of the site to understand what is actually going on with my users, the people sat at the keyboard.
Mm.
So the inventory in content security policy, we can say that the content security policy is the inventory, because if the content security policy is not accurate, then obviously things will be reported back to you. So once you've got a complete content security policy, you have a complete inventory of all of your scripts. I've seen other kind of, CDN vendors approaches and tag management. And again, they just present a UI with a simple list of all of the components that they've detected on the page. And then you have to provide that kind of written justification. In our UI, in Report URI, we have this. So you can go into your content security policy in the editor and you can tag each of the individual items with the description for what does this thing do? Why is this here? So I think this will be really helpful as well, kind of thinking a bit more into the future. One of the big issues that people have is then like, unauthorizing a script. Like if you remove a dependency, you really want to take away the ability for it to be present. It should be removed from your CSP or whichever other mechanism you're using, because otherwise you'll just have this growing set of dependencies over time. Of course, it will expand in the future, but it should also contract if you drop dependencies. So I think being required to kind of store this information is good, and it will help with that kind of management and acknowledgement in the future of like, what does this dependency do? And 5 years from now, when somebody new comes in and they're like, what does this piece of JavaScript do? Oh, I'm not sure. We'll just leave it there because it might be important. So I think acknowledging what we've got and why it's there is a good thing. And I feel like the content security policy approach is almost, destined to provide this naturally because you have to inventory your scripts in order to write the policy. So from a kind of overview process, like looking at this here, we've got a method to confirm that each script is authorized, a method to assure the integrity of each script, and then an inventory of all scripts with a written justification as to what it does, basically. So looking at that, from a technical view on the outside, given, the stated objectives of mitigating Magecart attacks, do you feel like that's a pretty kind of holistic overview of what a website operator might need to do to really have an impact in actually stopping these attacks?
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that there are other approaches, and even like Bern said before, I think things like WAFs can play a role somewhere along the way. But I guess what we both love about the particular CSP side of things is it's free and it's built into the browser, as is SRI, other than the problems that we just spoke about with integrity. So I mean, that seems to cover it. Certainly seems to meet the objectives.
It is, yeah, and you can see here, like the overall kind of, conclusion, I guess, of this section is the approach objective is unauthorized code cannot be executed in the payment page as it is rendered in the consumer's browser. So we have to be looking at that final thing that users have in their browser. And as long as we're taking control of the JavaScript in that page, the data dependencies for external data firing out, then I think that we can say we have a really robust strategy here for mitigating this issue. Now, to kind of top this off, the next section of requirements is then 11.6.1. So this is the second requirement that is targeted at these new kind of e-skimming, digital skimming attacks. And it just requires a couple of extra steps, actually. So they're quite lightweight by comparison, and we've already done most of the heavy lifting. So the requirement 11.6 headlined, unauthorized changes on the payment pages are detected and responded to. So one really kind of clear thing to pick up, and you'll see this throughout the rest of the wording as we continue. It says detected and responded to. It does not say prevented. Right. So like you don't have to, whichever approach you go down, they're not saying you have to step in and start blocking functionality and breaking things on payment pages. What we're saying is we must detect and respond. Because again, payment pages are very important. People have a very, very low risk tolerance for anything happening on a payment page that's bad in terms of breaking its functionality. So all we have to do is detect and respond to unauthorized changes. So the requirement, a change in tamper detection mechanism is deployed as follows. So you have to alert personnel to unauthorized modification, and this is a key thing that people miss, including indicators of compromise. So not just changes, but changes that indicate compromise to the security impacting HTTP headers. And they've clarified this, the script contents of payment pages. Previously, it said the contents of payment pages, and people were like, why do I need to track my images on the payment page? So they've clarified this to say the script contents of payment pages, again, as received by the consumer browser. Now, there's quite a few different pieces there. So break this down, into multiple pieces as you go through. But would you say that there's like, again, some kind of clear-cut technical approaches that we can take to satisfy this first requirement?
Well, that almost feels like a report only on a content security policy where you're not necessarily blocking it outright, but you're getting notified when something violates the policy.
Yeah. And again, this, without wanting to kind of toot our own horn and keep talking about CSP, this is really going to satisfy, I would say, most of this bullet point. And again, we can look at the script and tag management solutions, CDN, as Bern said, CDN in the middle approaches, they can do similar things. But the really kind of tricky part where we have to almost like step outside of a technological approach is the including indicators of compromise part, because this requires some external information. You looking at a change on your website is one thing, and we can say, oh, there was a change. This thing was not like this before. But then if I ask you, is that an indicator of compromise? Without some external
Mm.
information, could you reliably or directly answer that, do you think?
You need more context.
Yeah. On like what is the thing? First of all, we
Yeah.
need to look at what is the thing and then decide is that an indicator of compromise or does this just look like our third party dependency has added a fourth party dependency? So, as you said, we tackle this with content security policy in report only mode. The really good part of this is that we can alert personnel to an authorized modification. As soon as a change happens in the browser, then we detect an alert. We have our own threat intelligence feeds, number one, that we curate internally. And number two, we also subscribe to feeds from industry. So we enrich your report data with threat intelligence to say, for example, if you get a new dependency and it's a very high reputation domain, it's got no known malicious activity, and it's been registered for a very long time, we're not going to be too alarmed. If you start loading JavaScript from a domain that has low reputation and the domain was registered last Tuesday, then we're going to set off some alarm bells because that is a very different, it's the same thing. A change has happened, but they're two very different circumstances. And you're going to respond very differently to one of those than you are to the other. So, very valid point here. Again, I'll pick this up in the chat because it's
I
very
saw that
topical.
too. Yep.
Yep.
I was wondering about that.
So, what about the monitoring of CSP headers here? A CSP can't monitor itself, except it can. This is a very common thing that I hear from people, and I can completely understand how people get here, but a CSP can monitor itself. Now, I'm going to jump into my report your icon. I'm going to bring this over to the screen actually, because I wasn't sure if anybody was going to question me on this, and I was just going to provide the answer. But I'm just going to quickly bring over my report URI account, and we're going to jump into my production account here. So now we're going off script. This is this is definitely not in the script. But one of the things that you receive when you receive a content security policy alert, and if I just go to like the current day so that we've got lots and lots of data here. If I go and you can see all of my domains, this is my production account. This is not test or demo data in any way. If we look at any single one of these raw payloads that we receive from the browser, which we always store, one of the things that is always provided to us in the telemetry is a copy of the original policy that the browser was working with. So we can always track, and it's one of the things that we do track, the policy that you store and manage with us. So you will have a policy in the My Policy section versus the policy that you have deployed on your site. And the thing that the council want us to monitor for and to watch for here is if you have a content security policy and then it is changed to allow evil.com to load all of its JavaScript, of course, none of the alerts will fire. But because we have a beacon that we send on report URI, so one piece of telemetry is always sent to us, and we get a copy of the policy that's on the page, we can always examine the policy that you have deployed at that moment in time. And there's no way that anybody can control the content of that original policy string other than it being a replica of the policy that you delivered. So there's no way that data can be tampered with because it's sent to us by the browser. So because we get that copy of the original policy, and we can map that against your My Policy section. So if you have a policy here, we can map that against it and check it. Then we can monitor the content of your content security policy and see if it's had any changes made or any issues that have been raised. So you can monitor a content security policy with a content security policy. And that also includes for if the policy ceases to exist completely, because then what will happen is we will stop receiving the beacon. So I open this back up to the floor to Sam, who asked the question, and to see if that kind of sufficiently answered the question. And you can type a response whilst I also solicit some feedback from Troy and see what Troy has to say about my defense of that position.
Yeah, so paraphrasing, by default, the browser will send the entire CSP in any CSP report that goes through to report URI. So you can store that entire CSP and then you can reconcile that. But let me just understand this correctly. So report URI can then beacon out to the website itself and check what the policy on that is.
No, so we don't do any external scanning like that because it's very difficult for us, especially to get to a payment page, because you typically need to have
Yeah,
something in the cart and there's a whole
it's way
process.
down there. Yeah.
So what you can do is we have a beacon image on a subdomain, and you can put that on your page, but don't allow it in the policy. So for every
Oh,
single
okay.
page
Yep.
load, that one pixel image will always breach the policy and always cause one piece of telemetry to be sent. And that's how we can also detect that the telemetry stopped. Because
So so but
if they
yeah,
remove the
but by
policy
design, you're
entirely,
violating the policy the whole time
correct,
so that you
exactly
can get
that,
the policy. Yeah.
correct.
Okay. All right, let's
So
do it.
it's yeah, and all, like the other kind of biggest issue then is, of course, if they try and eradicate the policy and stop the telemetry, that gives you that cliff in the telemetry, which is like, well, hang on a minute, the beacon is no longer coming in. There is a problem on the page.
Yeah.
So Policy Watch and the beacon are currently in, because compliance with these new requirements is due by the end of March 2025. We currently have what we call Policy Watch, which is the feature, and the beacon in open beta with some customers now. And this works so well. And again, it's like, it's not, you could make the argument that's not really what it was intended for, but it works
Mm,
perfectly. It does
mm.
exactly what is required here. Because if the policy changes, we can detect it. And if the policy is removed, we can detect that as well.
Sweet.
Follow up from Sam here. That's a good approach. Thank you. Glad that we managed to answer that. I could stir the pot by asking about other security impacting headers. Correct. Now, one of the things further down in the guidance column, if we take a look at this, is it does specifically call out content security policy. Now, the other security, well, it's to the security impacting headers, not necessarily other. I was referring to other in the context of CSP. There are none that can negate the strength of a CSP. Additional security impacting headers here can only further restrict the functionality of the page. They cannot open up the functionality of the page. They cannot alleviate the protection that CSP applies. So no other header would have a negative impact on the protection of CSP. So yes, like it's an entirely valid point to raise. If you were to go to the documentation and scroll to the continued on the next page, you will see it specifically call out content security policy. But that is not to mandate, and this is where the council again have to be, kind of careful in not restricting the approach. They obviously can't mandate CSP because they want to leave this open to other technical solutions as well. So again, the proprietary script and tag management, external scanners. Did I bring in do I have a copy of it here? There. Yes. So in the example section, we've got, violations of the content security policy, changes to the CSP itself, which we've just covered. But then here again, external monitoring by systems that request and analyze the page, so an external scanner. So in those scenarios, we're obviously not expecting a content security policy to be delivered. So the implementation is open and free for people to choose any of these solutions that suits them. And there you go. They specifically call out content delivery networks and reverse proxies here in response to Byrne's question earlier. So the goal is to bring this back to the first kind of bullet point, and then the next two are pretty easy for us to start wrapping up on. We need to be able to detect and respond to changes. If you have content security policy as the mechanism, then you need to ensure that the content security policy stays in place and that the policy remains strict so that it is effective. Paraphrasing, that's effectively what the first point says. The second point here, the mechanism is configured to evaluate the received headers and payment pages. So, content security policy by definition is applied to the page. And of course, so it says headers plural here because you can have and allow like a CSP and a CSPRO header side by side, which is how we would iterate through change. So we have to monitor all if there are multiple of these policies in effect. And the final one, and Troy, you can wrap your answer to these two together. The mechanism functions are performed as follows: at least weekly or periodically at the frequency defined in your risk analysis. So again, this was a more kind of relaxed set of requirements here to allow those external scanners. For example, you can't have an external scanner that's scanning your website every 5 minutes. That would be a little bit too aggressive. So there is a very kind of relaxed time frame here, and it kind of shows like the time frame that you're expected to spot and respond to the changing. Because if you have a scanner running once per week, we're obviously acknowledging there is a short time period here in which a change can happen, and then you will detect and respond to it. Now, the great thing with CSP is, of course, we far exceed that. The first page load where there is an unauthorized change will detect. But, kind of looking at those two, I think that really kind of hones in on the desired technical approaches. And, you can see with the weekly or periodically, it's obviously allowing those external scanners. Things like CSP and tag management systems in the page are obviously going to do that on effectively a live basis. There's no delay. But would you say, again, reading those two, that you are happy that we're achieving, what the objective is with this technical approach?
Yeah, it does. I was just laughing a little bit at the bit in the or condition there about the entity's targeted risk analysis, which seems to be a bit of another one of those open to interpretation sort of
Yes,
clauses.
definitely. There is the standard is always kind of like very open to interpretation. And I know I focused a lot on not specifying the technical approach, so you can like kind of interpret how we would like to meet these requirements. And they do have to be very careful. I do kind of recognize that. But also at the same time, it would have been nice for them to set a minimum, kind of frequency here, like, or at least once per month, right? Like at least once per
Yeah,
month, you have
yeah.
to go and look at your payment page and make sure there is no malware on your payment page. So yeah, here we can see here, the approach objective, e-commerce skimming code or techniques cannot be added to the payment pages as received by the browser without a timely alert being generated. So we always have to come back to what is the objective, and that is the objective is if there is a change made to skim code off to skim card data off the page, we have to detect it in a timely manner. Anti-skimming measures cannot be removed from the page without a prompt alert. So again, we've got that covered. If you cease sending the policy, we can detect an alert on that. And there is a lot more, again, as you can see, it rolls over to the next page here. But, looking at the approach objective, we always have to bring it back to the objective. Like, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And the approach requirements are read in the context of our objective. So, yeah, we just had a follow up there from Sam to say thank you for the clarifications and that, yep, they agree. So that's good. What about you, Troy? Are you convinced? First of all, do you think that this will achieve what I said was the overall objective at the beginning, with more specific regards to Magecart?
I would be comfortable arguing it would.
It
But that sounds
is.
like a very caveated reply, doesn't
That
it?
sounded, it almost sounded like you
That
were an
ticks all the
auditor.
things you said.
I think you could get a job in compliance.
Oh
So
my God. Mm.
yeah, like I think when we compare what you're going to have to do to meet these requirements to what we had before, which was basically like the wild, wild west, right? Like you have a page or any page on your website for that matter, and we have some script tags on the page, and nobody knows kind of like exactly what's there. There's no inventory. I'm sure you could speak to many people within organizations and they don't know exactly what each dependency does or why it's there. So no one is kind of saying that meeting these requirements will be the perfect solution to the problem. But what we're saying is we're going to be a heck of a lot closer to perfectly solving the problems than where we are now, which is effectively, if we look across the web at how many organizations are using a content security policy, for example, that's really quite low. So I think it's better to look at this in the context of this is the beginning of the journey, right? Like we've got to start having the inventory. We've got to understand what code is running in our website and why is it there and what does it do. This is not the ultimate endpoint solution where we have everything absolutely locked down and impenetrable. This is just the start. This is just the beginning. And I feel like perhaps a tad late to the party, not to be too controversial and criticize the council there. But, Magecart have been running amok for over a decade now. And come March 2025, when you have to comply with these new requirements, that's not very far away now. And by the time we remove the holidays and Christmas, we're basically around the
Mm.
corner. So yeah, I do wish that they hadn't backed down on the 6.4.3 requirement to allow only necessary script for payments, because that would have imagine how simple your content security policy would be if you had one script tag on the page.
Yep.
Imagine how simple your job would be if you had to inventory and justify the existence of one script. So,
Marketing manager's not happy, Scott. That's what it comes back to, isn't it?
so yeah, it's not to say organizations still can't achieve that objective and trim down JavaScript on payment pages, but unfortunately, the requirements now allow you to keep that kind of free for all of JavaScript there. And the final point that I want to kind of end on now is many people are looking at these new requirements, and I work with them day in, day out. This is part of what I do is onboarding enterprise customers at Report URI. People look at the requirements and they always want to just like strike the minimum possible that they can do for the requirements. And if you meet all the requirements and kind of check the box and that's the exercise, then that's absolutely fine. And we can achieve that quite easily. But meeting the minimum of these requirements is only, the best idea if the only person in your threat model is your auditor. If we want to actually affect real change here and we actually want to have like a dramatic impact on improving security, then broadening the scope of your CSP, maybe just to the payment flow or to the account section of your site, just the section of your site that handles sensitive data. Maybe we're not too bothered about the brochureware and the product catalog at the front of the site. But remember, this is only required to be deployed on one page, on the payment page. And we do still see that as quite a common approach. And it really wouldn't harm to just kind of broaden that scope a tiny little bit and incorporate some more sensitive areas of websites. So, yeah, I think, from my side, we're pretty much running kind of spot on time there, Troy. And, as much as I'm kind of excited about these new requirements because they're finally requiring some accountability of the code running on our website, you and I have been familiar with content security policy for years, and both of us have been talking and blogging about it long before the council even picked it up on their radar as a requirement. And it's kind of interesting. Another thing that strikes me is so many times in demos and onboarding calls, I speak to people and I explain content security policy and what you need to do, and they go, "Is that it? Like that's it? It's
Yeah.
that simple? Where's your code? Where's your agent? Where do I install your widget on the web page, or where do I install your agent on the server?" And I have to explain to people that this is native functionality built into the browser.
It's built into the browser. And I think this is one of the things that we love so much about it, that the report URI as a product side of things aside, the fact that it is built into the browser for free and it's not something that you have to go and spend $1 gazillion on to put in the old days, a hardware appliance or even to Bern's point before, a WAF, it's like it's just literally built in there. I mean, imagine if you could install whatever you wanted onto every client to sort of manage scripts and dependencies and everything else. So like that would be a killer product, but it's in there for free. And the thing is too, how long has it been there now? Like a decade in mainstream
It has.
browsers.
Yep. Literally a decade earlier this year was the 10-year anniversary of the launch of CSP in Firefox. 10 years. So we've been able to do this
Mm.
for 10 years. And I just find that to be like absolutely fascinating. Now, I've not told you about this yet, actually, Troy, but we're currently in conversations on how to fix SRI. So I had some very promising calls with one of the standards bodies last week and with Google. So Chrome are planning to have this out next year. So they're going to switch SRI from being a hash-based approach to being a signature-based approach. So you can check the signature of JavaScript against the host, which means the host can patch it and fix it and then sign to
Very
attest
exciting.
that the new version is legit.
Ah.
So we will finally, hopefully in Q1 next year, I'm not making any promises, but we will have a signature-based approach to SRI, and you'll know how happy I'm going to be about this. We're going to have a new security header that does another exciting thing, but we're going to talk about that in our next webinar. So it's
Don't keep me hanging, man.
not to
All
just,
right.
leave everybody hanging there like, what is this new security header? Everybody knows how much I love security headers. There's going to be a new one, and it's going to be epic. So, with that, I want to wrap it up there and move it over to questions in our last 5 minutes of our session now. And I see I've been keeping an eye on the chat. So, I'm going to come back to a couple of things that have been mentioned just here. Um, so, first one, maybe question or comment. Let's find out. Ironically, our external page monitoring functions by loading inline scripts. So, for it to function, we can't enable our CSP while it's in use. So, if that's some kind of synthetic browsing that's being done externally, and it's monitoring and scanning your site, then it should just disable the content security policy. Because if you have control over the client in that regard, then it can just choose to do whatever it wants. But feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I could definitely give you some tips on how you could make that work much more nicely. Let's have a look. Another one here from Bernd. Why is there no header describing the communication sources of a web page? So, oh wow, okay. So I won't read this out loud because it won't translate very well into spoken words, but essentially some header that defines inbound and outbound sources for communication into the page. We can get very close to that with CSP, but as Troy stated earlier, it's not necessarily designed to be an input and output control mechanism, but you can effectively do a very, very large amount of what you just suggested with that. The new security header that I just told you that I was very excited about. Drop me an email and I'll send you a link to the draft specification because that would do what you're asking for. Another question here from Eric. On Report URI, is there a way to filter out WebSocket's localhost reports, which is the major item I see on my block list? FYI, I don't want to allow this source. So our filtering is pretty solid at the minute, but we still always allow reports to go through unless we're absolutely confident that the right thing to do is to filter them. So if we see reports caused by malware on the client or rogue browser extensions or things like this, then we will take those and toss them in the bin. But if we have any doubt that we're not sure what it is, we always allow it through to your account for you to make the determination. If so, you've just said here, like you seem pretty confident that you've identified the source of that. Drop me an email and fire that through. Because what happens with our review queue now is we obviously kind of review the most frequently reported items. So, if we see something being reported across thousands of sites, we'll review that first and see if it's junk or not. So maybe this particular one that you're talking about is perhaps just a bit lower down our review queue. But we are always working through that. Browser extensions are the worst things. They make changes to the page, they inject their own JavaScript, they violate the policy. As soon as we see a new spike, because some browser extension has changed its behavior, we'll try and review that as fast as we can. And if it looks like garbage, we'll throw it out for you. Another question here. Do you know how Twitter does their CSP monitoring? It posts it to the CSP report endpoint address. Yes, are they using some software on their servers to deal with it rather than using an external like Report URI or Datadog? Yep, so Twitter runs their own, as does Facebook, Google, and Yahoo. And I know the people involved in building and running that service. We all share the same pains in life of running global scale CSP reporting solutions. So we do have a lot in common with each other's day-to-day problems in life. But yes, Twitter does process their own. There's quite a few large organizations at that scale that do. And at that scale, it makes, absolute sense that you have the capabilities and desire to build and operate that service yourselves. But very quickly, you don't have to go far down the top 1 million ranked sites. And obviously, you can observe publicly who uses us as their reporting endpoint. You can see very, very quickly at what point it tips over to being much more beneficial to outsource this to a service rather than build your own. Because as it turns out, having an endpoint open to the internet without authentication that just posts data into your database, that's a really bad idea. It's literally like the worst of ideas. So yes, they do collect and curate their own, and so did the BBC actually as well. I know the person at the BBC who runs that. So if you look at all of the BBC global sites, they also curate their own. But
And you only have to make one little mistake in your CSP or your website, and you create a CSP DDoS cannon.
oh yeah, we've seen that when customers have done that accidentally. It's like, oops, we accidentally just blocked all of our assets in production by mistake, and now you're going to get like 1 trillion CSP reports from all of our 1 million visitors. So yeah, look, I think we've pretty much covered all of the questions off in the chat there. We are exactly on time. So first of all, I want to say thank you for joining us, Troy. It's always nice to just get like an open, frank view on things from somebody. And I'm always conscious of this, like I'm quite deeply invested in this, so it's nice to kind of test my thinking against somebody who's not this deep in the compliance hole as I am. I
Yeah,
think
thanks
well
for having
done.
me, mate. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the next one where I get to learn about this brand new browser security header that you're so excited about.
Well, everyone signed up to this webinar will receive the invitation automatically unless you've unsubscribed. So when that does get announced, you will automatically receive the email invitation. If not, follow me and Troy on the socials. I'm sure we'll give it a push then. But for now, thanks very much for joining us and have a good one.
Yes.